Welcome to the Soundtrap Education Summit, a free online event dedicated to empowering and amplifying student voice with the theme, Their Voice, Their World. We're bringing you inspiring and practical messages from musicians, educators, podcasters, students, and more that can help you make change in your classroom right away. I'm Matt Miller, the author of Ditch That Textbook and the moderator of the summit. Our sponsor and host of the summit is Soundtrap, a collaborative and creative audio editing platform. Soundtrap for Education empowers students and teachers to explore creative sound recording in all subjects for all ages and all ability levels. You can sign up for their free online course to learn how to bring music and podcasting to your classroom at academy.soundtrap.com. And in today's session, we're going to be getting into the nuts and bolts of audio creation for students. There's so much that students can create. And, as we were planning this summit, we were thinking, what better way to figure out what students can create with audio than to invite some students to talk to us about some audio that they have created. And so in this video today, you're going to get to hear from Lila Shroff and Daniel Wang. They both have some really fantastic experiences as students creating some really cool stuff for audio. And I know you're going to come away from this session with a ton of takeaways, a ton of things that you can do within your classroom. So what do you say we hear from them? So I'm going to kick it right over here to Lila. Lila, can you just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, thank you so much, first of all, for having us here. I think student voice is really important, and there's no better way to elevate student voices and to let students speak. Yeah, I think I first had my start with audio in middle school. I did a couple little one-off audio projects, but never really anything too big. And then my junior year, the summer before, I was so fortunate to participate in a program at Seattle's local NPR station called Radioactive, dedicated to spending the summer immersed in audio journalism. And from there, things really took off. I got to work at my school's radio station, KMIH 88.9 The Bridge, for a couple years. I worked at a podcast monetization startup, Glow FM, and also did a lot of sort of side audio projects to really dive in any way possible. I have a huge passion and love for storytelling, and audio, something about it just really clicked. So made it through high school. Now I'm taking a gap year before starting college next year, and still sort of stuck on this train of audio journalism and storytelling.
Excellent. Very good. So Daniel, can you tell us just a little bit about yourself as well?
Yeah. So hi everyone, my name is Daniel. I'm super excited to be here and bringing you some really practical tips to bring storytelling and podcasting and audio into your classrooms. So I guess I started with audio back in 2017. I was in 7th grade and I really wanted to find a way that I could share my voice with other people. And so one of the first things that came to mind was podcasting, because I was already listening to a couple of podcasts. And back in 7th grade, I did a lot of Google searching. I looked through different books at the local library, how to start podcasting and everything. But something I really couldn't find was how hobbyists could start podcasting and how independent and small, even students like me could start podcasting just for the fun of it. A lot of things that I saw were different businessmen or businesswomen looking at podcasting as a way to grow their business, grow their audience. And so back then, there wasn't really a lot of information out there for people like me to start their own podcast. And so I started doing research, and in 2018, a year later, I decided to jump head in and start my own podcast. And my first podcast was about the environment. And so some of the stuff I talked about, I remember the first episode was about global warming and with the ocean rising. And so I talked about different research ideas that I came up with. And then I still remember the next day I woke up and I saw that I had 3 downloads when I released the podcast. And I was so intrigued because, I thought about this and it was like 3 different people. In my mind, I had it at all different countries and continents across the world, listening to my own voice. And I thought it was so incredible how I was able to, I guess, transfer my voice all across the world through the audio of my podcast. And that's actually what initially started getting me interested into podcasting. And then more recently, I created a student podcast curriculum called Student Podcast, and that basically hosts all of my notes that I took over the past couple of years, and it helps walk students through creating their own podcasts and just being from the first step to the last step and creating their own podcast and sharing their voice that way.
Wow. That is those are two pretty incredible stories already. And so I'd love for us to be able to dive a little bit deeper into this and get a couple more details, because one of the big parts that both of you I think love about doing audio is the storytelling aspect of it. So let's hear your stories a little bit. So can you tell us just a little bit about kind of your just as a student, as a kid, really getting into audio and trying to find ways to express your voice and everything? Like, what drew you into it, and what even made you think that you could do it? Because I think a lot of times kids will look at that and they'll be like, oh, that's cool, but I don't even know where to start. Like, how did you actually get into this in the beginning?
Yeah, so I think on one side, I had the incredible fortune of being part of this amazing program at our NPR station KUOW that let me really learn the fundamentals. But I think there's something special about audio as a medium. At this program I did, they always told us audio is the most visual medium, which sounds really counterintuitive, right? You're listening to somebody speak, how can it be visual? But there's just enough that a storyteller or a student or an audio creator can give that lets you really like listen to the story, but then create your own embellishments in your head. I don't know if that makes sense.
Mhm.
But you can like hear somebody explaining everything and then you can like watch it play out in front of you. And so I think it's like one step above, there's like a little more complications in just writing something out, but you don't have to worry about the whole like complexity of developing a video, and so it's kind of inviting in that way. It's not super intimidating, but you really feel like you're doing something well produced and really cool. And then it also really, I think, allowed me to have all these interesting conversations and get to know all these amazing people, but through this formal like mechanism of radio and audio. I could say, hey, I want to have a conversation with you for this podcast, but I didn't have to, it's a little intimidating to just ask people to talk to you, but then you have this like specific format. So I think, yeah, that a lot of support and loving the format as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. Daniel, does that sort of resonate with you? Does that sound kind of like you too?
Yeah, definitely. So I really liked how Lila pointed out the visual aspect of audio. And I think, as Lila mentioned, it does sound counterintuitive. But if you think about it, you know, storytelling and just simply voice is the most purest form of like an expression of mind. And so if we hear someone else's voice and we don't see their face, we're constantly thinking about, what sort of intonations or what sort of different complexions that they have that convey their thought even more. And so I really liked what Lila pointed out with audio being a pure medium of voice. And I also really, I guess, understand what she says by it's not as intimidating as video, because actually one of the first things I wanted to start was a YouTube channel, but I found it really intimidating, sharing my whole entire face and like sharing my whole entire I guess surrounding with different people who I didn't know. And that's actually why I started podcasting, was because it was much less intimidating than video and YouTube, and it was just as accessible too.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. And correct me if I'm wrong on this. Doesn't it seem like podcasting is about as accessible right now as it probably has ever been? Like, there's so many ways that you can get into it, and so many ways that students could do it on their own. They could do it in the classroom. You could have like a class podcast. Like, there's so many, because it used to be like this guarded mystery of how to get on iTunes like years ago, and it was all complicated and everything. And now it's such an open medium. Neither of you think similarly about that?
Yeah, I think podcasting is a relatively new field. I think it started back in 2004, yeah, around there. And as you can see, it developed so much into what it is now. I think um, it is probably one of the greatest sources of media to this day. And I think it's developing so much and it's so changing. But at the same time, it's really nice to point out that starting podcasting is really accessible in this day and age. You don't need like the highest quality microphone or the most expensive mixer. You can really start with, I guess, something as simple as a phone or a computer, and even like different software to mix up your audio is almost free to this point. And I'd also really like to point out that just like YouTube, hosting your audio files is free with different hosts. And so if you look around, there are so many ways and so many methods of creating a podcast. But in the end, it's really easy to get into, especially since when you have all these resources around with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, that's cool. So Lila, I wanted to follow up with you. You know, Daniel's experience is very much in podcasting, and you've had some experience with radio, and I know there's some similarities and some differences and everything. And I just was curious to see from your perspective some of the things that you've gotten to create through radio and some of the lessons that you've learned and everything. Is that the kind of stuff that, because obviously we mostly have educators that are the audience for this summit here. Is that the kind of thing, are there certain parts about it that could make their way into the classroom, that could be useful in the classroom? Like, are there certain things that you learned through that process that, that teachers could use as they're planning their lessons, or they're trying to think of what they want to teach their students?
So first of all, I think right now podcasting and like audio journalism and radio are sort of all melding together. But I think there are some things sort of distinct and different about radio journalism that can actually really inform a classroom setting. And I really think it's like the lens when you're doing a story as a journalist. You really have a specific way of thinking about it. You're trying to find your experts to interview, you're trying to find how things link together, and you're trying to like piece it together very specifically. And I think in a way it's like you're solving a mystery, like as a detective, and pulling together different things. And I think for students learning about a new subject, it's very similar. Like if I'm sitting in class trying to learn about like oh gosh, the agricultural revolution. I'm sorry, I'm reading a book right now. That's the first thing that came into my head. There's the sort of textbook way of here's the information, now absorb it. Or there's the I'm the student detective, for lack of a better way to say it. It sounds kind of cheesy, but walking through
like it,
and pulling together sort of the different clues. And I think the same way you would approach a story as a journalist is sort of how you would approach being a student detective in a classroom, unpacking a mystery. So sorry for the cheesy metaphor. And I don't know how like practically that translates, but to me, that's where I see a lot of parallels aligning.
Yeah, well, I think that makes perfect sense. One thing I didn't mention to the two of you before we came on air was that I was a journalism major in college and graduated and actually worked in newspapers for a little while. And I love how you put that you're a student detective, because that's basically what it is. It's not, if I think of like, board games like Clue, where you're trying to figure out who did it, it's not exactly like that, but you're trying to put the pieces together. You're trying to find the truth. You realize that there are different variations of the truth to some extent, or everybody tells kind of a different version of it. And how can I take all of these bits and pieces of what I've found and put it into something logical that the listener can understand? And there are just so many crossovers for that in the real world, right? Yeah. And so, Daniel, I kind of wanted to ask the similar thing to you. Again, since we've got lots of educators in the audience for this, what are some of the things when it comes to podcasting? What are some of the crossovers that you could potentially see if you had to put your teacher hat on for just a second and try to see things through the lens of a teacher? What are some ways that could, potentially cross over into the classroom? Some of the lessons you've learned, some of the ways that it could fit into a lesson, any of that stuff.
Yeah, so I think that podcasting and um, rearranging different sound bites onto a coherent podcast is also very much like an essay. For example, if you're trying to prove a point through an essay, you're going to have your thesis, and then you're going to have your supporting evidence, and then you're also going to have your claims. And so with podcasting, it's a lot of being able to share what you think, bringing outside evidence, and then also be able to corroborate your thesis through all these different pieces of outside information that you bring in. And so podcasting is a lot of stringing in these different narratives into one nice piece of I guess in this case audio that you can have your listeners listen to, and maybe at the end of the podcast they'll understand what you're trying to say at the beginning, and they'll maybe be on your side for your thesis. And I also like to expand on what Lila talked about with being almost like a detective. One of my favorite projects this year with my podcast was tracking down this scientist who actually won the Nobel Prize in physics in 1978. And he actually found and discovered evidence for the Big Bang right behind my high school. And so, more in the literal terms of being a detective, my friend and I, we structured this podcast as almost like a mystery where we had the listener listen in on what we've done each step of the way to get in touch with this scientist. And so, for example, we walked them through, walking on gravel and walking to that laboratory and knocking on the doors there. And so that was really one of my favorite projects, because I realized that podcasting wasn't just sort of, putting all your thoughts out there. It's stringing together this narrative that, shows the world like a bigger picture of what you're thinking of.
That was so good. I'm like hesitating here so that I can get that written down. Let's go back over that last sentence again. Did you realize how articulate you sounded when you actually said that? Podcasting is stringing together a narrative of a bigger picture of what you're thinking of. Oh my goodness, that's so good. So Daniel, I want to dig a little deeper into that, because you started talking about your process. And I think that would be so helpful when it comes to teachers trying to figure out how this crosses over into their classroom. So let's go back to that for just a second. Let's see. And then Lila, I'd like for you to keep this in the back of your mind, because you've very much gone through the same process in many ways too. Let's talk about the process for just a second, because I know teachers are going to, if they see the value of this and they see like what you just said, Daniel, rearranging a podcast is like writing an essay. And if there's sort of a logical set of steps to it, walk us through the process of, from the moment you think of a topic and you go, oh man, that would make a really good podcast episode. Where do you go from there? Like, how do you even start? How do you start to get all the ideas out? How do you rearrange them? How do you know what to put into it? And like all of that stuff, like walk us through your process on that.
Yeah, so I actually like to think about it in, I guess, a narrative in 4 different steps. So there's the beginning, and then there's like sort of the beginning, middle, and then you have the end, middle, and then the end. And so that's how I thought about the project that I did with the scientists in the backyard of my school. And so I really like that structure, because it sort of allows you to ringing the reader at the beginning and then also build up the climax. And it's very similar to Freytag's pyramid in English class. And I also think that with podcasts, you have to go in with a clear mind with the logical progression of what you want to say. But at the same time, once you dive into the action and once you start, speaking your mind, you have to understand that you have to go inside with an open mind. You can't be afraid to change what you're saying, like in mid-sentence, and you can't be afraid to change, your narrative, especially when, you're behind that microphone and talking to that microphone, because the best audio clips come from when you're speaking purely your mind. The best audio clips don't come from a script, on the other side of your computer, but instead they come from, different forethoughts that pass your mind while you're speaking, while you're running off your script. So I think going into podcasting with an open mind, but also having that logical progression listed down for you is really, really beneficial.
That's fantastic. Very good. Lila, how about you? As far as process, like if you're If you're a student in a class and your teacher just said, okay, you're going to do an audio journalism piece, you're going to do kind of like a radio, news narrative or, something like that. If you're a student and you just got that assignment, what's your process to try to make it happen?
Sure. So, and first of all, I'll zoom out a little bit and say, like, if you're using audio in a classroom, I think there's a sliding scale of applications from like record, I guess I'm on the wrong side, record a quick little like response all the way to a fully finished product. And so, like, and I can elaborate sort of on some of those tangible, like what those look like assignments and whatnot later, because I have some thoughts on that. But for approaching things from the process for telling an audio journalism story really starts with the story itself, which is sort of an obvious thing to say, I guess, but you really want to create sort of the focus of your story. And so the sort of format I learned was someone doing something for a reason, even though. So you have your main character or whoever that your story centered on, you have their action, you have their motivation, and you have this tension. And then once you have that story, you find the people you're going to interview, you write out all your questions, you do the interview, listen back to the tape, transcribe it, maybe do follow-up interviews. You piece together your first draft, and that might look like, super rough, just the audio cuts pulled, and then you go in and out, or like the audio clips pulled, and then you can speak your narration, and then you keep developing your drafts, maybe 2 or 3 drafts until you have a recorded final one. And then the final piece is the voicing and the recording and making sure you sound lively and exciting. And actually, that's not the final piece. Then you do the all the in-depth production. But I think that process sounds a little overwhelming, right? Like it sounds like there's so much to do. And I think, if you're going for professional quality audio journalism, like great, that is the process. But if you're going for sort of a day-to-day educational tool, I think it can be scaled back quite a bit. And it can be as simple as anywhere from a conversation to a pre-written thing that you're just recording to a very simple sort of like bare bones version of a fully produced piece. And that doesn't mean that it's any worse. It doesn't mean that it's not engaging to listen to. It's just, I think, a lot more approachable for a student.
Yeah. It's like you don't have to try to knock it out of the park with This American Life, like right out the gate in your class. And actually, let me follow up on that idea of, you don't need that, super, super refined professional audio quality to get your ideas across. If you were talking to teachers, educators, because you are, if you were talking to them and, you even said too, that the process can seem overwhelming, and it can seem overwhelming for students, but guess what? It can seem overwhelming for teachers too, right? If it could feel sort of overwhelming and you wanted to give them a simple starting point for teachers, simple starting point for students, what's an easy place? And Daniel, if you've got follow-ups on this after Lila, let me know. But what's kind of a simple place that you think, one of those places where educators or students can go, I could do that. They look at it and they go, yeah, that's totally doable. What do you think?
Yeah, so I have some thoughts on sort of small little assignments or ways to incorporate audio into the classroom. One would be an interview assignment, right? If you're doing a unit on history in, the 1970s, and you want students to interview somebody in their life that was alive in the 1970s, in their home, hopefully, because COVID, or through the internet, you can give the assignment, go interview somebody on this topic and ask them to specifically address like these set of questions or these tensions or whatever was happening. And I think interviews are super simple, right? You're not asking them to edit, you're not asking them to do anything fancy. It's just have a conversation and record it. And I think that's not an unrealistic sort of expectation. It's just something that's like you would do anyways, and maybe in a in-person assignment, in-person classroom, but you can adapt it really well to this digital classroom. Another thing to do might be, hey, we're doing a project on, whatever this is here. Like another thing to do would be like, if you're doing some sort of unit and you want to get student responses, but everybody's tired of the like online discussion forum that seems to be coming up again and again and again, instead of having students do a written response, say, hey, let's do a spoken response. And I think there's something really cool about that because, I know a lot of classrooms, like I know in Italy, for example, oral exams are really popular. And I think for me as a learner, I can type something up and I can make it sound pretty in a written way. But when you're talking, you're really forced to understand what you're talking about. And so having students submit like or oral responses to a prompt is cool. And then the last thing I could think of would be like audio lessons, like create a 4-minute lesson on X topic or Y topic and share it with your classmates so everybody can post their quick mini lesson in audio and all their other classmates can learn from their fellow peers without having to do a fully produced video lesson.
Mm-hmm. Oh my goodness, you just dropped like a whole bunch of very useful ideas there. The three that I grabbed were to do an interview assignment, which is super easy. I mean, like you said earlier, you said it's just have a conversation, record it, and then do it instead of doing a written response to a spoken response. And then you were talking at the end too to kind of like create a little audio lesson to share with classmates. Those are all things that I think any of us can do. And I'm gonna go back to Lila one more time. Daniel, I promise I'm coming for you, okay? But whenever Lila, you just touched on this a little bit, so I wanted to follow up on it. Whenever you do these lessons, because a teacher might look at these and go, oh, an interview assignment, we could do that in an online document. Oh, written response instead of spoken response, like what do I get out of that? Create an audio lesson to share with classmates. And I think you started to touch on it a little bit. You said something to the effect of whenever you're doing spoken word, you're really forced to think about what you're talking about. Are there benefits to doing these in audio instead of doing them in the written form?
Well, I think the answer to that question is going to be yes.
Mm-hmm.
There's definitely things that are good about writing, but those things we use so much writing in the classroom, and I think one thing is if you're thinking about a test or a short response answer, on one hand, it's really easy for me to not really know what's happening and sort of make it seem more like I do. Or on the flip side, it's easy for students to sort of get lazy and say, oh, let me just search something up, see what the internet's telling me. But when you're speaking, I think you really are forced to like be spontaneous. You're on the spot, you're using your own brain, and you really are, they talk about the best way to understand something is by teaching it to somebody else. And I think, if I start creating my lesson in a spoken way and I'm like teaching it to somebody that, will listen to it in the future, really embraces that concept.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think in terms of like, yes, you could do a written response instead of an oral response. Yes, you could do a written interview, but I think humans love conversations and speaking and the sound of their own voice. And, to me, if I'm told interview somebody on this topic and it can be anyone in the world online, that's so much more exciting than, oh, send a couple interview questions by email to some expert and see if they respond. It really facilitates that human connection and emotion and excitement and gets me really interested in learning.
Mm-hmm. Very well said. Love that. Okay, Daniel, time to kick it over to you. Thank you for your patience as we kind of worked through some of that stuff. I think we got some really good stuff out of that. So let me ask you kind of the similar question there. You're talking to educators, maybe even you're talking to students, and they see the value in all of this, and they're thinking, where are some places where we can start? Where we don't have to do like full studio production, mixing multiple channels into something super professional. Like what are some places where you think they could get started?
Yeah, so more practically, I think that Anchor and Spotify are both really good platforms to just start. And so I just want to go off like a little bit of what Lila said. So sort of from like a sociological perspective, we can think of education as a century-old structure where the learning is based off of, I'll give you a textbook, you read it, and then can you answer these 30 questions and regurgitate what you read? And I think that, with learning, the best learning is teaching someone else what you learned. And so if we really look at, COVID right now as an opportunity to look at education and really have it benefit the students, in the real world, are students really going to be asked to, read a book and then tell me what the book says? But instead, students are actually going to be asked to, tell me what you think about this. Right now, just speak to me. Let's bounce some ideas off of each other. You saw this information, and what did you glean from it? What did you get from it? And can you sort of convey it through your own words? And I think if we look at it that way, and we see that education is really about, for the student's future development, and we see that if we're going to really base it off the student's future development, then we should really look at education as a way of getting the student ready to be able to have these conversations rather than just reading a textbook, gleaming over the information, and then having a 30-question test and regurgitating verbatim what the text was said.
Mm-hmm. I thought that was such a good point there, that you made right there at the end. We should look at education as a way to have important conversations. It's not just, can you answer these 15 multiple choice questions right? And, oh, there you go, now you're ready for the real world. Like, there are important conversations to be had. And I mean, if you look at the world that we're surrounded by right now in so many ways, there are lots of big conversations, lots of big decisions, lots of big actions that need to be taken. And, don't you think that we need bold, confident leaders, well-spoken leaders, people who can speak to these problems and come up with potential solutions and then be able to voice them? I don't know, I kind of riffed on your answer right there, Daniel, but I think that was very well said. So, okay, so let's kind of turn the conversation. So what we just did there was we thought of a handful of ways that educators could start doing audio in kind of like small ways and bite-sized pieces, like the I could do that tomorrow type of stuff. Let's start to shoot for the moon just a little bit, okay? Let's say that they start to get settled into that a little bit and they're like, okay, this is pretty good. We were able to record some stuff. We use Soundtrap to record some interviews or to, mix a couple things together. And now we're starting to get our feet under us. We're starting to get a feel for this now. We want to go bigger. We want to do something impressive. We want to make something substantial. We want to put a little bit of a dent in the world now, what are some big places that we can go with that? I'm going to turn this one to Daniel first. Lila, be ready. Okay. Cause I'm coming for you. But, Daniel, I can imagine that podcasting will have something to do with your answer probably, but I'm very curious to see, if you were going to encourage students and teachers on how they could go big on this, what would it look like?
Yeah, so I really like that question because it really shows that, say if a teacher really likes podcasting, we're making big waves in the education system. And so I think with that, one way that teachers can start seeing podcasting as a whole aspect of their curriculum is I talked to Lila before this, and we were talking about sort of a unit system where, for example, if the class is reading The Catcher in the Rye and we want to focus on the motif of, Holden calling other people phonies, we can split the class into different groups and have students create their own podcast to be able to like examine and explore how phonies really tie into this whole narrative of The Catcher in the Rye. And then at the end of the unit, we can have students all sitting like together and listening to a separate podcast and having a class discussion about different points that they brought up within the podcast. And we can just foster, I guess, natural discussion and natural, debates over whether, what this student said was valid. And also we can just be able to foster a collaborative learning environment where students are really, focused on, they're really driven on learning what the teacher wants them to learn instead of getting the next grade, and then going on from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Oh, I could totally see that. Yeah. And then, okay, I'm going to hold that idea in my mind there, where you were just, your example was, with The Catcher in the Rye, you've got the different chapters, the different parts of the book, and being able to kind of think through that. Because I have a follow-up question to that, but I'm going to kick it over to Lila first to ask her the big picture question. So if teachers and students, again, if they want to go bigger than just let's record an interview, and no shame to the let's record an interview, because that's very powerful in and of itself. What are your thoughts on that? How could they go big?
So many thoughts. Okay, so wow, this really excites me. And I think there's sort of three different categories I'll break these down into, but they're all sort of related. So piggybacking on the using podcasting in the classroom, there's a few different ways to do this. So the first is, you pick I envision it as sort of like a collaborative classroom podcast. And so the first thing I can think of is that every student throughout the year has their own podcast that sort of chronicles their educational journey. And maybe your first unit, everybody makes an episode. Your second unit, you make an episode, and by the end of the year, you have your 6 to 10 or however many units worth of episodes for each student. So you sort of have like 25 seasons of different episodes, all related to similar content. A second play on that is to do a collaborative classroom podcast that links together the different units throughout the year. And, maybe if you're a physics teacher, you appoint different students, or students can volunteer themselves to take the lead for every unit. So you end with one sort of season's worth of podcast episodes about physics, but it's a collaborative classroom project. And then the third take is what Daniel was saying of, for each unit, you take a lot of different aspects of it. So, if we're studying American history, we can have season 1 of our classroom podcast is the 1700s, but every episode tells the story of a different group's perspective. And again, you repeat it in the 1800s, you repeat it in the 1900s. So this is sort of like core ways I see podcasting being used in the classroom in a way where you're really creating a finished product. Then from there, I feel like there's sort of extensions of, one of the great things that I've seen in the past few months amidst all this craziness is sort of, in some ways, there's a lot of concerns about educational inequality that are, really valid questions that we're discussing. There's also been a sort of explosion, I think, in the accessibility of educational resources online. And so I really like the idea of transferring some of this knowledge and that is being discussed in classrooms and making it open to everybody and saying, here's the discussions we're having in our, 9th grade US history class or 11th grade US history class or whatever it is. Let's open this up to the world and share it. And then a third, oh my gosh, so many ways. You should cut me off in a second. But another thing I can think of too is if you really want to go big and you were talking about really cool things, everybody's stuck at home right now for the most part. And so encourage students to talk to the best of the best, the experts in the field you're talking about, and then share those conversations with the rest of the world. And, you can really do things that are enabling learning in the classroom and then sort of scale that impact and in really big ways that I think are really powerful.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. I love all of this stuff. This is fantastic. I get to do presentations to teachers, and one of the topics that I discuss is student voice, and of course podcasting is a part of it. And I've always thought, and so this is Lila, just to kind of riff off of a little bit of what you were saying, I've always thought about a collaborative class podcast where once a week, and just using something as simple as as Spotify or Soundtrap or whatever, you go around to the different students in your class. I'm thinking of like a 5th grade class where it's all self-contained, or you could even be like one teacher with 6 classes, and you just grab this stuff from different classes. You go up to students and say like, hey, what did you learn this week? It could be something from your class. It could be something from another class. It could be a trick that you learned on the skateboard. It could be like how to play a G minor chord on the piano, or, anything, because it starts to celebrate the idea of learning. and that learning doesn't just have to happen in the classroom. And so if students start to share what they've learned and they put out, it could just be a simple little 1-minute clip. You do that with, 10 students and you publish it on Friday every single week. Like, think about the body of work that would be collected within that. And I like to ask teachers, who do you think would listen to that? The parents would listen to it. The grandparents would get all about it, but I think people in the community would listen to it too. The ones that want to know what's going on in the classroom. And Lila, you were just talking about that, and I was thinking that would be so cool. So Daniel, what do you think about all of this? So are you having any thoughts coming to you about any of this that we've been talking about?
Yep. So I really like what Lila pointed out was, bringing our classroom and showing it to the world. And I think this sort of reminded me of, I guess, back in 4th grade, we were promised to sort of connect with a class in South America. But unfortunately, it didn't work because, we were in different time zones and it was super difficult to coordinate classes and coordinate video calls. And so I really like podcasting because it's asynchronous where, someone 14 hours ahead of you might be able to listen to your voice while you're not there and while you're not live. And I think this is an incredible it's an incredible way to bridge the gap between different schools of different socioeconomic backgrounds.
Yeah. Yep. Totally agree. Okay, Daniel, I'm going to come back to that question I told you I was going to follow up on, because we were talking earlier about big ways, ways that we could go big with audio. And what you were talking about led me to want to ask this question: who's the audience? I think, one of the things that we've all talked about during this session is that there is an inherent value in audio, doing it differently than written form, because you have the emotion, you have the voice, you have the personality, you have a different way of thinking spontaneously. Like, all of this stuff has come up. But I think the one thing that we haven't talked about as much is, what about that audience? Because, that's obviously a big part of what we're doing here, is trying to figure out who are we creating this for and how can we serve them, right? And so my question for you is, if we're going to make something like a podcast as a class, if a student's going to go make an individual podcast with any of that, how do we figure out who the audience is? Or maybe a different way of looking at that is, how do we find an audience? Like, any of that stuff. Do you have any thoughts on any of that stuff?
Mm-hmm. So from my personal experience, I also always think about those first 3 downloads I had on my podcast and, who were these people? And I think that sort of feeds into the magic of podcasting. But also from my personal experience, I shared this with a lot of my friends, with a lot of my family. And I felt that they had a lot of experience in listening to what I had to say, that, our conversations also included, what I said on the podcast. And I really like this idea of having the community listening to a podcast. So I come from a smaller town, and I really love the idea of, 4th graders talking about, different colors of the rainbow, and then also having, people in the community, the town mayor or committee members listen to what the students have to say. Maybe we can have middle school students address the committee meeting at our town hall each month, and sort of call in through a podcast. And I really like this idea of not knowing who your audience is, but at the same time directing your audience to your voice and to your opinions.
Yeah, no, that makes absolute perfect sense. Yeah, totally agree with that. Lila, how about you? As far as an audience goes, I know in audio journalism, you're if you're working with like a radio station, to some extent the audience is already sort of built in, but in some ways, I mean, you can't just assume that they're out there or anything. And you also want to produce for a specific audience. So anyway, related to any of that stuff there, what advice or ideas do you have for teachers or students who are trying to figure out the audience for their work?
Yeah, so I think community is great, especially, in these current times. People are really invested in what's happening in their community and what's happening in their community schools. So it's a really good starting point. And then I think the other really target sort of demographic is other students and teachers. Why be limited to our own virtual classrooms when there's hundreds and thousands of others happening at the same time?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, I, as a student, might really enjoy what I'm learning in class, but I also want to hear what other students are learning on the same topic. And so I think that's a really interesting way for both students to hear what other students are learning about, teachers to see how other teachers are teaching. And so I think within the sort of educational community, and not necessarily just in my city or state, but almost on a global level, the whole world is open.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think it also depends, right, on what the topic, what the unit, what you're learning, and different, niches will fall into place. Certain audiences will really want to listen to your microbiology unit or whatever it is, right? And I think I think you have to sort of be really flexible and adaptable if you're really looking to grow your
Yeah.
podcast in that sense.
Yeah. No, I agree with you on that. And I think one of the things you were sort of touching on there is, like you said, if especially with lots of classes being virtual in, these times, we don't just have to stay within our set classroom right there. And I think what you're speaking to there is perspective. And see, that's one of the things that fascinates me about being able to connect outside of your classroom is that everybody has a different perspective on things. If you go to a different city within your state, if you go to a different state within your country, if you go to a completely different country, people start to see things differently. And so I think, again, we keep talking about the collaborative nature of all of this, being able to interview, being able to pull in different people's audio. I think, especially with audio tool, we keep coming back to Soundtrap, and I know Soundtrap's a sponsor and they're not the only ones that you have to do this with, but that's the one that I keep coming back to. Like, it would be so easy to grab some audio. I mean, even just with a simple audio recorder and have somebody pull it all together. You could collect audio from all over the world potentially about a certain topic and see how people's perspectives vary. That's one of the things that I think is so cool about this.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say, like, I can totally see. There's a thing for, if you're not familiar with the term vox pops, there's some Latin meaning behind it, but basically the idea is if you're a journalist, you go out on the street and you ask, 20 people the same question, and you piece together the 4 or 5 most interesting answers. And you're totally right. Why not make that a global thing? And why not use some of the driving questions behind the curriculum or lessons you're learning? And that would be so interesting to ask people around the world the same questions and stitch those together. And yeah, wow, that there's so many different exciting things I think that can come of this. And I really like the theme also of perspective. And I think that's something that's been missing, and a lot of people say have been missing from our classrooms. And so what better way to sort of add in perspective and also embrace the digital classroom? And I think they marry really well together in so many different ways.
Yeah. Daniel, let me hand that one off to you. What do you think?
Yep. So one thing that I actually just found out was this thing called Pandemic Diaries, which is a program that the New York Public Library is currently running. And so what they do is basically they gather around 25-minute clips of audio from different people, I guess, all across the world, and they're trying to string together, a historical narrative of life during the COVID crisis. And I think that speaks really, really well to getting these different 20 people on the streets and having them speak their minds, and then also putting it together into a podcast.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we just came up with 2 really cool mediums that I didn't even expect. Lila, you called those vox pops, right? Did I get that right?
Yeah, and I think I can't tell. I think it's like voice of the people or something like that. I didn't take a Latin, but
Yeah.
pretty sure that's what it is. And I
Yeah.
actually, yeah, I just had one other thought. I think one thing we haven't discussed it yet is sort of the room for creativity in audio.
Yeah.
And there's, creativity, I think, is such a powerful force and such an important thing to learn. And I think there's so much room to get creative in audio. And there's also, one of the things that I always learned about, middle school, high school was the importance of primary sources. I think there's also so much fun you can have, pulling TV clips or archival audio, and then adding in, the modern day commentary. And there's so many ways to embrace like pre-existing audio that lives in the internet and have fun with that as well. That's just another way.
Oh my goodness. I feel like we could just riff on these ideas like all day long. I think we could sit here for hours and do this, this has been so cool. All right. So I wanted to wrap this up real quick because we're getting to that time. We wanted to ask the same question all the way across the board. And so, with any of these videos, if you're watching this now, with any of these videos, you're probably familiar with this question at this point. And I'll throw this out to both of you, Lila and Daniel. What can we do? And I know our conversation has been kind of about this, but we'll use this kind of like as a closing point here. What can we do to help students use their voices to change the world? If you could leave educators with kind of like a parting thought when it came to that, what would it be? And I'm going to kick this to Lila first. What do you think?
Short and sweet, trust them. I think students know what they want, and just let them speak their minds a little bit deeper. I think allow students to tap into their passions and interests and enable them to explore those. And once you find something that you really connect with and you really click with, the rest, it'll go from there. So I think those are the two things I would say. And those two alone, I think student voice can do some pretty powerful things.
Yep, totally agree. And then Daniel, how about you? What can we do to help students use their voices to change the world?
Yeah, so I think first off, you have to be open and understand that students, they might have opinions that are different from your own. And besides that, something more practical is just don't be scared by, all these professional podcasters with these like huge entire, podcast setups. Podcasting is super easy to get into, especially in this day and age. And I think my only regret with podcasting was not doing it earlier. It took me a whole entire year to start my own podcast. And I just really say, if you have the mindset, if you have the creativity, and if you really want to do it, just start now, because that's the only regret that I have.
Yeah. If you have the mindset, if you have the creativity, if you really want to do it, just start now. I love that. That's fantastic. I'm going to put that up on the bottom there as we finish that up. So, oh my goodness, this has been so good. So if you're watching this video during the summit, you will notice that on the speaker page, we have lots of links to different resources that you can use. And part of it includes Daniel's podcasting curriculum. So Daniel, I wanted to give you just a quick second to tell us, kind of the idea behind that and what we might find in it.
Yeah, so I touched upon this a bit earlier, but I started this because I really found that there was there weren't many good resources out there for students to create their own podcast. And so it's a nine chapter curriculum where I sort of transcribed these notes that I took back in 2017 and 2018 into a more coherent, structured, I guess, guidebook or curriculum that students and teachers can follow along. And there's different topics. For example, I talk about the craft of podcasting, of structuring a narrative and storytelling. And I also talk about, beyond that, more of the logistics of podcasting. For example, gathering your audio clips and putting it onto a place where you can edit your files. And so, it's really a really good resource and a crutch for students who want to start their podcast and who, if they find that they need help, there's a lot of resources on there. But at Student Podcast, I sort of, took all these resources and put them onto, I guess, this chapter book or these different on this website.
Excellent. Very good. And so you can go check that out. Did I get the link there? Studentpodcast.com is the place to go for that?
Yep. Perfect.
Excellent. Very good. Okay. Oh man, I hate to bring this to a close because this has been such a good conversation. We've covered so much ground and had so many useful little nuggets of wisdom. I wanted to give you both an opportunity real quick. If anybody watching this wants to get in touch with you or ask you follow-up questions or something like that, social media, wherever you want to direct them to, do you have any place that you want to share? Let's go with Daniel first. What about you?
Yeah, so recently I created a Twitter account called I think just @student_podcast. It's really simple, and I guess you can reach me out through there.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. That's a good one. How about you, Lila?
I'd say the best place would be to connect with me or send me a message on LinkedIn. It's just my name, Lila Shroff. And I'm currently on this gap year exploring the world of audio and education. So I'm super excited to have any discussions or, I always love meeting new people. So please talk to me.
Yeah, awesome. That's great. Very good. Well, thank you both so much for all of your insights, your experience. This has been super, super helpful. So thank you so much for joining us. And I want to thank all of you watching the video. Thank you so much for joining us for the Soundtrap Education Summit. And we will see you on the next video. Take care.